So now you're with somebody that maybe something felt good, but the relationship is not going to be good. Nothing else feels good in that relationship, but now you're in it. So it's like, take the time for all of that. Take the time to assess where you are, assess who you are, and assess who it is that you want to be, and that you two come together whole and not as two halves trying to become a whole. So, looking at all of those things and making sure that what they say are their values, they're living those values. Because for a month, I can be anything you want me to be. But what does that look like in 6 months? What does that look like in a year? What does that look like when it's snowing? What does that look like when it's storming? What
Or
does
when
that
you
look like
have a
when I'm
newborn screaming at 2 a.m. and you're both
right?
exhausted.
Yeah, or when I'm doing really well, or whatever. What does that look like? How are you when you're doing well? How am I? When I'm doing well, how are you? When I'm doing poorly, how are you? Are our values still aligned? Because if they're not, it's going to be even harder when you bring somebody that into that dynamic.
Who
Because
doesn't
like
care how you feel?
yeah, because you're already tired, and when we're exhausted, we're irritable. And we
Hmm.
say things that we mean at that moment. And
Hmm.
maybe we'll never mean it again. But at that moment, that's what I meant. And so I'm very particular about not speaking when I'm emotional, because I'm going to mean exactly what I said to you when I said it. So my apology is going to be a lie, because at the time I said it, I meant it. And so I'm very mindful of using a journal and thinking through my thoughts. Like, am I feeling something that's not there? Is this there? What does this mean? How am I going to respond to this? Is this the best time? I have to do all of that because I have a sharp tongue and I know it. And it's like, so knowing those values going in, understanding that when people are irritable or tired or a situation's harder, how does that person respond and how do you handle their response? All of those things need to be in your upfront before you bring somebody into the world. And if that's not there and you still are committed to that marriage, then you need to work on that. That has to be an everyday process, every day. So,
And truthfully, anybody who wants to be in a long-term relationship, whether it's a relationship with a romantic partner or to be a parent, you really have to do a lot of introspection yourself, because
yeah.
once you have a child, that child is going to expose
Oh,
everything about yourself that you
mm-hmm.
thought you knew, didn't know, or thought that you did know, and you found out that it's all wrong. Because once you're put in, number one, if you had your baby naturally, those hormones are going to do a number on your body. It's going to change the way you think. It's going to change the way you act. It's going to change everything about you. And it sometimes could be permanent. And if you have a partner that's not willing to support you while you go through these changes and have the understanding that you are going through something that is going to fundamentally change you and they don't have control over, it's not going to end well, because relationships require that understanding of permanence and impermanence, that attitudes come and go. And just
Yeah.
because your partner acts a certain way in a certain time period doesn't mean they're going to be acting that way all the time.
No.
I've seen time and time again all the flighty relationships where they're exposed to a certain facet of their partner's personality and they completely freeze up. They're like, "Oh, I don't like that part, and so I'm going to go." And I think that's something that a lot of people aren't very adept at dealing with anymore. They're not. I think part of it might have to do with the dissolution of families. I often wonder how much the divorce rate plays into attitudes, but I also wonder if the divorce rate is rather a symptom rather than a cause, where we have gotten accustomed to just giving up on things. And so people don't have as much practice or as much exposure to people that discuss putting a, like, actually working through it. There's not very many stories nowadays you hear of people, like, there are stories of people that are together 50, 60, 70 years, but you don't hear very much of people fighting for relationships. You hear more stories of people cheating and getting caught cheating and giving up on relationships. You hear more stories of like crazy exes and people fleeing the country or fleeing to a different side of the country because their ex is abusive. Like, we hear so many negative stories and no stories of couples coming back together. Like the romantic love stories that we do hear are more of the like Cinderella princessy type, like, oh, they met each other and it was like sparks flew and they had similar personalities and it just all worked out and they lived happily ever after. Like, we don't have very many stories of actual resilience in relationships, of people standing by for their partners when their partners are not themselves anymore because they're going through something. And I think that might be something that kids are missing out on, where they're not seeing people fight for each other as
Mhm.
much. And I think that's something that kids that do have parents that stayed together understand in a way that they can't explain to kids that have divorced parents. I like at the Catholic school that I went to, I was one of the few kids that had parents that were still together. Most of my classmates had parents that were divorced. And they all had very dramatically different ways of looking at their future than the kids that were kids of uh, whole families. I noticed that those who had parents that had separated seemed more interested in careers that would get them someplace, whereas the kids that had families that were still together were more interested in their personal passions. Um, I don't know if it's because of how their parents raised them or if it was the effect of the divorce or it's just like personality or coincidence. But I do seem to notice that the people that are more are less willing to fight for their relationships tend to also embody a certain type of personality. It's almost that uh at least from my generation, I've noticed there's a lot of the women out there that kind of have a take it or leave it attitude towards relationships, where it's like, if you're not the one, then don't even bother. Like, I'm just gonna leave. Like, if I'm not getting what I need, if you're not giving me exactly 50 and I'm doing the other 50%, then I don't want this. Or I've even seen some people go as far, like, they have the ick list and the list of like, you must do all of these things. And I think people also have a very skewed uh um view of relationships and what they should be. I think some people can be a bit more greedy and kind of pretentious about it and almost expect more than they like. It's almost that attitude of like, you have to give me everything, but I'm not going to do anything in return because you have to cater to me. And if you can't cater to me, then you're not the right one for me.